already here. And today we were just doing a continuation of unfinished parts of last week. So there were, some of you have slides, some of you don't, but whoever want to speak today, please let me know. I mean, you can raise your hand, or there is a raise hand button, because when somebody start talking, I cannot see everybody. So if you push the raise hand button, your video will jump into my screen, so I know. So that's
Jason,
yes.
where is this raise hand button?
Reactions on the right, the right button. There's a smiley face, says reaction, and
okay. Raise hand. Thank you. Okay.
No, wait a minute. It's not. It's a thumb up, but so it's where
reactions.
No, there's a specific raise hand emoji below the other ones.
Yes. Yeah, but I don't see it. I think in participants.
No, it's in reactions.
Reactions?
Yes,
reactions. Oh, there is a more there. I see. Okay, my fault. There's Jason, a more there. So you can find it.
Also, Jason, before we proceed, I don't have much to add to what I said last week. I've got a couple of slides to expand a little bit on the ideas of Elliot Jacks. That's all I have.
Yeah, you can show your slides. I still haven't found that raise hand. Reactions. Or maybe I'm not allowed to raise hand. You are. Okay, I see why. Because I'm a host, so I don't raise hand. Okay, so please go ahead. I think Klaus had sent the attachment first, so we will let Klaus to talk first, and then whoever will follow Klaus to express your opinions about the previous three discussions.
Okay, let me, I mean, my thoughts were the following. I think the first presentation with Lugio was made very clear to me that biological metaphors have very little to do with social phenomena, largely because biology is not dealing with the language that organizes its parts. This is a totally different kind of system. And he showed actually that there are so many aspects that where the self-organization or a hospital doesn't conform with autopoiesis. We have to have a different term. There is no doubt something that is, let's say, unique to a hospital. But I said also, the hospital is probably not a good idea as an example for a system. Yes, it is a system, but it is a system that is part of a larger system, namely largely the medical discourse. In this hospital, people go in and out. They are appointed not because they are hired, but because they are certified by the medical community, and they play different kinds of roles. I think if one wants to describe a hospital as a closed system, it is probably a closed system for a manager. The manager has a limited amount of responsibilities, and beyond that, there's very little. He can hire maybe people and so, but that is not really a good example of a system. The system is just part of the medical discourse. So that was, I think, one of the comments I had actually of the first part. I don't know if I should go in this second one, but I think the notion of self, and I think that was also was alluding to. Maybe I have a little bit more radical position. The self. If I say I, then I refer to myself. If perhaps a formula in which the function is the result of the operand, that is the same, that is not a self. It's a self-reference, if you want. That means the one symbol relates to the other. It's from the outside that we impose a self, and that might just not be very helpful. And particularly since I was saying a hospital can't talk. There are people in the hospital that talk, but there is no self. I think the notion of autonomy, that is to me far more appealing, because autonomy is something that you can observe from the outside. I mean, when you cannot influence it, when it goes by itself, that is an issue of autonomy. Well, I think this is probably, I have more to say, but maybe that's enough to start.
Lowell.
Klaus, thank you for your insight that biological insights may have limited applicability when you're dealing with creatures that have language.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you also for your American Cybernetics conference meeting on Sunday. That was excellent. Thank you. But when you're talking about a hospital and you're talking about cybernetic critical theory, I think there's an important insight. And the insight is, it's not about the managers talking. It is about the way the structure of the complex of hospitals that should be the topic of cybernetic inquiry, because of a hospital medical complex that creates and structures and confines the language and discussions in certain ways. So as in any culture, it provides a capacity to create circuits of language, an organization of language. And so a proper use of cybernetic critical theory is not to talk to the managers and how they communicate. It's how they live in the larger society and constrain, like a military industrial complex that puts the communication between the contractor and the government in a positive loop that then defines a pattern that may no longer be applicable to the zone of fitness, and our security ideas are undone. So cybernetics looks at the counterintuitive structuring of the larger communication within a society.
I fully agree with you, but I think you went beyond the hospital, which I try to also say. In Philadelphia, for example, we have several hospitals. They work together. The doctors go from one place to another. They share even the website for clients. That there's not a single hospital that could be isolated as an entity with closed boundaries. The boundaries, as I was saying, there are boundaries, there are physical boundaries, but they are meaningless. The boundaries is probably, the manager it's just a stereotype that I used, but there are some limitations, for example, of financial accounting. I think financial accounting is separate from each hospital, but this is not what we are interested in. You're right, that is a larger society issue. And for example, the certification of doctors, that is done, but the universities do that. The medical discourse imposes on the university what kind of things should be taught. And then they are certified doctors, then they have to begin to practice in one hospital, in another hospital. And so it's much more a complicated system. So I think it is too limited to look at one hospital. That is, at least in Philadelphia, it's a whole system. They work together and exchange doctors and whatever. So I agree with you. But I think the presentation was actually, is Maturana's concept of autopoiesis applicable to a hospital? And I would say no. And in fact, he said in many cases, there are few elements that one can probably learn from it. And I'm not opposed to learning anything from anyone else, but I think one has to realize that any metaphor that one uses from one discipline to another wipes out actually what happens there before and imposes a certain kind of perception that is dominated by the nature of what they call the source domain of the metaphor imposing on a target domain. And when we use a biological metaphor on, let's say, a hospital, then suddenly all the language issues disappear.
Thank you.
Could I make a comment at all,
The
please?
one point is what we're looking for in cybernetics is a critical theory that allows us to distinguish good interactions from vicious interactions. And I would just say that epistemology is the new ethics, because if the complex of military hospitals constrains the delivery of services, so the example that Bob Nisley talks about in West Virginia, they've had a better deployment of the vaccines because they have a public health system. They don't have hospital systems. They're lousy in hospitals. But they have the connections and interactions that are able to use and provide trust networks that are able to deliver a vaccine. So what's the epistemology of the system and what does it have the consequence of, is my interest.
Lute, Jonathan,
I
and
think
Bob.
I also want to thank Klaus for his excellent contribution on Sunday evening, and also for this contribution. I may not agree on everything, but for me it is helpful in these things to keep in mind Herbert Simon's model of horizontal and vertical differentiation. So vertical differentiation has to do with what we were discussing as the relation between self-organization and organization. And the self, I completely agree with Klaus, in the case of society, disappears because it is a distribution which cannot speak as a person can speak. So the dynamics are different, but the general insight from Herbert Simon is that then, assuming on the expectation that there is a next order system, I think society is a system which is constituted and reproduced in terms of expectations. It's not something that is, but something that is expected, or traditionally you could say it's not part of the cogitatum, it is part of the extensa, it's part of the cogitatum. Assuming that, you get in the lower level system horizontal differentiation. And these horizontal differentiations are, for example, management, patient care, medicine. So all kinds of subsystems which are then operationally coupled. And this is again Niklas Luhmann's concept of operational coupling, although Herbert Simon already had it. He distinguishes between loose coupling, operational coupling, and structural coupling. It comes also partly from Maturana. I must say I find Maturana very enlightening, precisely because Maturana is very strict on it, that one should distinguish between the semantics which are in the system, which are not, which looks like language, and the super language which the biologist uses and which he doesn't analyze. He's very clear about that. He doesn't want to go there. He's a biologist.
Jonathan.
So my feeling is, for want of a better reason, I always try to pull everything into Stafford Beer's viable systems model, and everything Lowitz said about Herbert Simon's vertical and horizontal variety or differentiation is covered by Stafford, as well as I think a lot of what Klaus was saying. In that a hospital, I spent a lot of time looking at what's a police force, what's a military, what's a hospital, and thinking that they were viable systems. And the more I looked at them, the less viable I found them to be in many cases. Particularly the military is totally unviable most of the time as a separate system. And what it occurred to me is that the reason is that they are system too. They are a function of society. If you have a society, you're going to create a hospital, you're going to create a police force, you're going to create a military almost, or some sort of order for the coordination of that society. So they don't need to be viable systems. They're supported by the society itself, the system ones in the society. So but then what interested me, going back to what Loet's talking about and Lerman, is it's this word autopoiesis. If you start to look at a system through its internal operations, not its input and output, if you don't look at what a hospital does, if you look at how it maintains itself, then the autopoiesis of that gets very interesting, because it has to be able to support itself through stable systems that are reoccurring. And I think the only people, whereas I hear quotes of Manciarana and Varela and autopoiesis, the only people that have taken the problems of these forward are the inactivists that I see with Di Paolo, who have addressed the issue. I mean, we end this arguments of whether a system is autopoietic or not. For me, that's almost an irrelevant argument. It's the principle of autopoiesis, whether it counts as autonomy or not. And I think you can see that making a hospital that can maintain itself is important.
Can a hospital maintain itself without a great support? For example, they need patients, they need the university for education, they need the city to support it. This is not an independent organization. And my question actually,
No.
when you asked autopoiesis is fundamental a theory where the structure of the organism produces the very parts that take place in the structure and maintain itself. What are the parts that the hospital produces to maintain itself?
Well, I've looked at this, and this is to me a question of boundaries. Where do you draw the boundary of what is being maintained or what counts as a component? Yeah. So let me take Stafford Beer, a model, say, of an organization that has factories. If we look at it as an input-output system, then we're looking at what the factories are producing. If we turn that to look at its internal structure, this organization has to maintain its factory. Maybe it has to build new factories. So it depends. If you draw the boundary bigger than, say, a single element, say the component is the factory, then there's maintenance on that factory. It's being rebuilt. It's maintaining itself. Now, the same argument I would put for the cell. Manciarana and Varela backed away from saying autopoiesis applied to social systems. But if you take a cell, which they tended to go back to biology, but let's look at just RNA inside the cell. There's no component inside the cell which can't exist by itself. You only have to draw the boundary bigger to the whole cell. The RNA doesn't maintain itself. The mitochondria doesn't maintain itself. The whole system has to maintain itself. And Manciarana and Varela backed away from second order autopoiesis. They talked about it and then sort of stopped talking about it, because that becomes interesting is when the structural coupling between two systems becomes so dominant that they rely on each other, that they become part of a bigger construct. Now they called that multi-autopoiesis. I forget the name they gave it to. But it's the question comes down to where
Julian,
the boundary.
Allopoietic.
Yeah, but they
corrected by the other. All hospitals are embedded in larger systems. Certainly in the UK, we have a National Health Service, and we have regional hospital boards and so on. So any hospital is allopoietic in the sense that it's partly created by that. Not that I would use the biological terms myself for hospitals. But allopoietic.
Although you could have a hospital that is a small going concern, a private hospital that's not part of a bigger health system.
Of course.
Later, I will tell you a story about maybe none of these or all of this. But Bernard, you raise your hand. You have something to talk. And after Bernard is Jamie. Don't worry.
Yeah, yes. I need to. Okay. Well, last week I talked about organizational psychology.
May I interrupt? Maybe I wanted to say something specifically about what was just mentioned, and I think you're bringing in a whole new. And I'm wondering whether that's all allowed for me to give feedback or whether I should wait. Jason.
Okay, please go ahead.
Can I go ahead? Yeah.
Yeah.
False.
Okay,
you're related.
I apologize, Bernard, but it was directly to what Lud said, that he said this autopoiesis is the language, the object language is the biological system, and on the meta language they were not interested in. And I think that's precisely the limits of the whole autopoietic construct outside where it was originally used. Is there is no language inside biology. That's totally anthropomorphizing a biological system. We are the ones who use language to produce an idea of a biological system, and now we project that on the reality, and then we identify with that reality, and then we do things in response. So so I just wanted to throw that out there, because I think that is what Klaus is trying to say, that this is really, we should be very careful about this whole idea of language, to project that on systems and then think, oh, well, this is what they're doing, their language, while in reality, we are the ones who have the language.
Okay.